So, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
How do you like to define public history?
How do I like to define public history? Well, I don't like to define it because I don't think it needs defining. I think it's all around us. It's unavoidable for me. Everything I do is making the past present for the public. That's it, I suppose.
Okay, so what are your favourite examples of communicating and exposing the general public to history?
My favourite examples? Well, I work in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and that's a pretty favourite example. It's got just about everything anyone could be interested in from the past. Yeah, I think museums are probably at the moment my favourite examples. I think fictional accounts of the past are also very interesting. I think they can be in some ways more incisive than actual history, tied to facts. I think fictional accounts, speculative accounts, can really get. I'll tell you a really good example. I think with one of my own scholarship is mostly 16th, 17th century, but I work a lot also on spying and the history of intelligence. And Anthony Blunt, great, one of the Cambridge spies, great art historian, had a very, very strange account of himself, an autobiography which told people absolutely nothing, and a novel by John Banville called The Untouchable, which is a fictional account of the life of Anthony Blunt, is far more revealing than the man himself. So that's a nice example.
I think it was Camus who said that fiction is the lie by which we tell the truth.
Exactly.
So you would prefer the sort of model of Gore Vidal and Hilary Mantel to the professional public historians?
Yeah, it certainly reaches more people.
More accessible?
Yeah, I think it probably is. And Hilary Mantel's a good example. I don't think she's any less serious about the historyness of history, but she's more serious about the storyness of the story. I think that's a great gift. And
how has the V&A adapted to our new digital landscape?
Slowly, very slowly. I mean, I think it realizes that it is absolutely crucial to getting people in the door, to helping them to understand what we have, what we don't have. I mean, one of the big problems is we have at the V&A something like 4.5 million objects. We only have about 5% on display at any time. And the other 95%, how do you get that to people if it's not behind glass, if it's not in front of them? And how do you get people to experience and kind of open up those objects when they can't touch them? So for both of those things, for their capturing of it, for their telling their own stories to other people, all of those, I think, are happening in a digital domain. And so we have to do that now. We have to embrace it. But it's slow work. The museums are not leading the digital advances. They've been adapting a bit slowly. I think that's something that we all need to take on. And the other thing is the museums, there's a bit of a backlash saying, but we're all about objects. And I think there's a very stubborn opposition between the physical and the virtual that the museums haven't really overcome. And I think that's what we probably need to do. And the V&A is a very interesting example because it was founded in the 19th century, and it was very much driven both by original artifacts and by reproductions. Their cast courts, their plaster cast courts are world famous, kind of foundational collections. And I think that's a great example because those really were the digital of the 19th century. Those were the Google and Google Cultural Institute and Google Art Project and Google Books. And I think that's the thing that we need to embrace and reinvent, but with help. It's expensive. We don't really have the in-house money and the in-house expertise to do it. So we're tackling that.
And there must be a case for more investment there because museums in the United Kingdom are subsidised and they're free.
That's
But
right.
they also, I mean, most of the flagship museums happen to be in the wealthiest area of London.
Right.
So I suppose one job will be to make what the V&A has to offer accessible to people in the rest of the UK.
That's right. Not to mention the rest of the world. Sure.
Indeed.
Exactly. And the digital for reaching an audience who are not physically present. Even an audience who is and then isn't. Absolutely. I mean, there's a new example that I think is very promising, which is the Cooper-Hewitt Museum that just reopened in New York. Smithsonian's Design Museum is really interesting because they have these digital pens that you take around with you, and you both call down information while you're there and you record your trail around the museum. So in effect, you sort of pick up the objects that you see, and you can then later revisit all of that information that you've gathered. I think that's a really nice model.
Apart from your museum, which is your favourite?
I think maybe the Pierpont Morgan, the Morgan in New York. It's partly because I'm a historian of the book, probably first and foremost, and it's one of the great book collections. But it also combines the thing I've now come to love at the V&A, which is the crossing of periods, and it's very much associated with contemporary music and a huge number of music manuscripts from 20th century, 21st century. And I like that range from Michelangelo drawings to scores by Philip Glass. That's great.
Sounds like it's more of a library.
I suppose it is in its first, it's a house. I mean, this is the other thing I am very interested in. The Huntington is a good example. The Getty is another example in America of these places that kind of hover somewhere between private, domestic collection and public institutional museum. And in fact, I think that's another interesting aspect of public history, is that interface with the formerly private and the formerly domestic. And I think there's an obligation in some of those cases to not just make them public and not homogenize, not just absorb them into the public museum taxonomies, architectures, etc., but to actually respect and recover and represent the original orders that the collectors intended or invested in them or wanted us to see. And I think that's another real problem or pressing issue when a place like the V&A absorbs such massive amounts from other places. What happens to those other places? They're just forgotten or erased.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.